Hibo's tray crashed across the marble floor the exact second the spotlight hit her face. Laughter exploded through the grand ballroom. The ugly kitchen girl, someone shouted. "Is this tonight's entertainment?" Wine spilled over her torn dress. Guests raised their phones. Her stepsisters smirked from the front table, while Marwo folded her arms in triumph. Hibo stood frozen beneath the blazing lights, breath trapped in her throat, humiliation burning hotter than the room. Then the host's microphone screeched. Since she loves to sing so much, he sneered, "Let her sing live." The music failed. Silence fell. And the billionaire in the VIP row slowly rose to his feet. Before Hibo had sung a single note. What would you do if the people mocking you were forced to watch you rise in front of them? Tell me your country and local time below. And if you love emotional stories filled with justice secrets and powerful comebacks, subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Hibo had learned very early that some houses were built not only with stone and glass, but with cruelty carefully arranged into routines. By day, the villa of Marwo Hassan glittered like something cut from a dream. Sunlight slid across polished floors. Tall white curtains breathed against wide windows. Imported perfume lingered in hallways where expensive laughter always seemed to live. Guests praised the elegance of the home, the taste of its owner, the beauty of her daughters. They called it a place of refinement, but Hibo knew what lived underneath refinement. She knew the sound of orders snapped before dawn. She knew the sting of bleach in cracked fingers. She knew what it meant to scrub crystal goblets with an empty stomach, while hearing Ifra complain that the tea was too cold, or Sarah whine that the mirror had not been cleaned well enough. She knew how Marwo's voice could glide like silk in public, then harden into something sharp and merciless the moment the doors closed. And she knew one rule more clearly than all the others. Hibo was not allowed to sing. The rule had never been written. It did not need to be. It lived in the way Marwo's face changed whenever music drifted too close to the girl. It lived in the slaps that had followed the first few times Hibo forgot herself and hummed while sweeping. It lived in the cold warnings whispered at her ear like poison. "Your mother used songs to fill your head with foolish dreams," Marwo had once said, tightening her grip on Hibo's chin until the girl could not look away. "You are not special. You are not an artist. In this house you work." But memory did not obey Marwo. At night, when the villa finally quieted and the city lights of Nairobi flickered beyond the iron gates, Hibo sometimes stood in the kitchen alone and remembered her mother's voice as clearly as if Nadira were still beside her. Her mother had never sung loudly. That was what made it beautiful. Nadira sang the way some women prayed softly, as though speaking directly to broken places no one else could reach. She had sung while braiding Hibo's hair. She had sung while stirring soup in an old pot. She had sung when fever kept the child awake, when storms rattled the windows, when grief pressed close, and there was no money for medicine or comfort. Her voice had not made their lives easier, but it had made pain feel survivable. "You do not sing to impress," Nadira had once told her, smiling, as she placed a hand over little Hibo's chest. "You sing to tell the truth from here. Real voices reach where beauty cannot." Hibo had been too young then to understand why her mother looked sad after saying it. Years later, she understood too much. After Nadira died, truth left the house first. Then kindness, then the last of warmth. Marwo had arrived wearing black, crying, elegantly speaking of family duty and sacrifice. She had told neighbors she would raise the poor orphaned girl as her own. She had called it a noble burden. People praised her generosity. They never saw how quickly Hibo's room was taken away, how her dresses disappeared, how the piano in Nadira's sitting room was covered, locked, and eventually removed, how every photograph of Hibo's mother vanished from the walls one by one until it became possible almost to imagine the woman had never existed. Only one thing remained, a small silver pendant on a faded chain, Hibo wore it always hidden beneath her plain clothes, tucked against her skin where Marwo could not easily snatch it. She never knew why the woman hated the pendant so much. The few times Marwo noticed it, something dark and panicked flashed through her eyes before anger followed. "Take that filthy thing off." Hibo never did. On the morning after the humiliating performance plan had first been whispered among the household staff, the house woke earlier than usual. That evening's gala had turned Marwo feverish with ambition. She moved through the villa barking instructions, arranging flowers, checking guest lists, insulting everyone in reach. Ifra and Sahra floated behind her in matching silk robes, their faces half-painted, already discussing singers, sponsors, and wealthy sons, as if the entire event had been designed as a throne for them. Hibo was carrying a crate of glasses to the back pantry when she heard her own name. "Make sure she stays invisible until we need her," Ifra said, laughing. Sarah's laugh joined hers, thinner, crueler. "No, let her come out exactly when everyone is comfortable. That makes it better." Marwo lowered her voice, but not enough. "Do not overdo it. Humiliate her, yes, but not so much that people start pitying her." They all laughed again. Hibo kept walking through the crate, suddenly felt heavier in her arms. So that was it. Not even accidental cruelty this time. Planned, measured, polished like silverware for display. She should have been surprised, but she was only tired. By noon, the kitchen had turned into a furnace of motion. Pots hissed, oil spat, trays of spiced meat and saffron rice passed from one sweating hand to another. Hibo moved through the chaos with practiced silence, chopping herbs, washing platters, carrying loads twice her size, because the others knew she would not complain. It was easier that way. Complaints gave cruel people energy. Still, she felt it all day, that unease, that tightening in her chest as though something was waiting just beyond sight. The only calm came when she slipped for a moment into the rear courtyard to shake flour from her apron. There, under the weak shade of a jacaranda tree, old Abdi was repairing a broken mop handle. He had worked around the estate for as long as Hibo could remember. Officially, he was the cleaner for the service quarters, the man people forgot to notice unless something had gone wrong. He walked with a limp and spoke little in front of Marwo, but his eyes missed nothing. He looked up as Hibo entered the courtyard, and for a moment he studied her face in the quiet way that always made her feel seen rather than inspected. "You have not eaten," he said. It was not a question. "I'm fine," Hibo replied, automatically. Abdi grunted, unconvinced. From the pocket of his worn jacket he pulled a small, paper-wrapped piece of mandazi and held it out to her. "Take." She hesitated. Food offered kindly had become so rare in her life that it still startled her. "Thank you." He watched her eat half of it in 2 quick bites. Only then did some of the tightness leave his expression. "The house is noisy today," he said. "It always is." "No." He adjusted the wooden handle in his hands. "Today it is the kind of noise people make before they do something ugly." Hibo managed a faint smile. "That describes most days here too." But Abdi did not smile back. "You should be careful tonight." Her fingers stilled around the remaining piece of bread. "Did you hear something I heard enough?" A breeze moved through the courtyard, carrying faint music from the rehearsal hall at the front of the property. Expensive instruments, tuned microphones, a polished stage being prepared for polished people. Hibo looked down. "It doesn't matter. Whatever they do, I'll survive it." Abdi's face changed, then something old and sorrowful surfacing beneath the weariness. "Some humiliations are designed to become cages," he said quietly. "Surviving them is not always the same as escaping them." His words lodged under her skin. She looked up, truly looked at him now, and noticed again the strange tenderness he sometimes carried when speaking to her, as if guarding a memory too heavy to set down. "Why are you always kind to me?" she asked before she could stop herself. For a second, Abdi seemed caught off guard. Then he glanced toward the house, as if measuring the danger of being overheard. because not everyone has forgotten who you are. The courtyard seemed to go still. What does that mean? But before he could answer, a shrill voice cut across the air. Hibo Sara stood at the back doorway, one manicured hand on her hip, fury in her eyes, as though Hibo had committed a crime by breathing outside the kitchen. There you are. Stop hiding and come steam my dress. If you ruin it, I swear I'll make you regret being born. Hibo straightened at once. The moment with Abdi shattered, but not completely. Something remained behind, something unsettled, something bright and dangerous. As she moved toward the door, Abdi spoke without raising his voice. Child. She turned. He was no longer looking at the mop handle. He was looking directly at her, and his next words landed with strange force. When truth has been buried for too long, it does not die. It waits. Sara snapped her fingers from the doorway. Now! Hibo lowered her gaze and went inside. But the rest of the afternoon, while she ironed silk-polished cutlery and endured the steady venom of the women who owned the house, one forbidden thing rose inside her and refused to go back down. Not a song. Not yet. Hope. By sunset, Marwa Hassan's villa had transformed into a kingdom of polished lies. Strings of warm lanterns glowed across the garden like captured stars. White floral arches framed the marble entrance. Black-suited guards stood still as carved stone, while luxury cars flowed through the gate in a glittering procession. Inside, crystal light spilled over gold-trimmed tables, champagne towers, and a stage built at the far end of the ballroom, beneath a screen the size of a house wall. Everything had been arranged to declare wealth before a single guest spoke. And wealth answered. The city's powerful people arrived wrapped in silk diamonds, perfume, and entitlement. Politicians laughed too loudly. Investors measured each other with eyes sharper than knives. Wives with perfect smiles scanned the room for social weakness. Influencers lifted their phones before they had even removed their gloves. Musicians, fashion executives, real estate men, charity women, every face wore the same expression beneath its own version of elegance. They had come to be seen. Marwo floated through them in deep emerald satin, greeting each arrival with maternal grandeur, as though she had built the world herself, and merely allowed the rest of them to live in it. Ifra and Sara trailed behind her like decorated daughters in a private parade. Ifra wore silver with a neckline chosen to provoke admiration. Sara wore crimson and laughter sharpened into a weapon. Together they glowed beneath the chandeliers exactly as Marwo intended, and somewhere behind the ballroom walls, carrying trays, and avoiding attention, moved the girl they had dressed in ashes. Hibo's uniform had been replaced for the evening, but not with kindness. Sara had thrown her a pale, ill-fitting gown that might once have belonged to one of the household staff for formal service. The fabric was too thin, the waist too loose, the hem too short on one side where it had been carelessly altered. Against the spectacle of the event, it made her look less like a worker and more like a joke pretending to be one. That's perfect, Ifra had said earlier, stepping back to admire the damage. Not ugly enough to be invisible, just ugly enough to be memorable. Hibo had said nothing. There were days when silence felt like weakness. Tonight it felt like armor. She moved through the ballroom with her tray balanced carefully, offering glasses to guests who rarely looked directly at her face. When they did, their eyes always flickered first to the faint scar along her cheek, then to the simplicity of her dress, then away again, with the quick indifference rich people reserved for those they had decided did not count. Still, she saw everything. She saw Marwo subtly steering important men toward Ifra and Sara. She saw Sara laughing too brightly at compliments she did not deserve. She saw Ifra watching the entrance every few minutes, waiting for the one arrival that mattered more than the others. Then he came. The atmosphere shifted before Hibo even saw him. Conversations slowed. Heads turned not from courtesy, but instinct. A path opened through the crowd with the smooth immediacy of fear disguised as respect. Samir Arden stepped into the ballroom without haste, but power moved around him like weather. He was taller than Hibo had imagined from newspaper photos, broad-shouldered in a dark, tailored suit that carried no unnecessary flash. He did not smile for the room. He did not perform charm the way other wealthy men did. His face was composed, almost severe, but not cold in the empty way Marwo's was. His restraint felt earned, like steel that had once been fire. Beside him walked two executives and a quiet female assistant with a tablet in hand, but they seemed less like companions than orbiting objects around a fixed center. Marwo's smile stretched brighter. "Mr. Arden," she said, gliding forward. "What an honor. Truly, your presence elevates the entire evening." Samir inclined his head politely. "Mrs. Hassan." His voice was calm, low-controlled. Ifra stepped in next, all softness and invitation. "We were beginning to worry you might not make it." "I said I would come," he replied. "That was all." Yet Ifra laughed as though he had flirted. Hibo, standing near the drink station, found herself staring before she meant to. Not because he was handsome, though he was. Not even because of the aura of command everyone seemed to bend around. It was something stranger than that. When Samir paused and let his gaze travel across the ballroom, his eyes moved over faces, fabrics, exits, ceilings, staff positions, taking in the whole room, with the habit of a man who trusted appearances less than most people trusted breath. Then his gaze landed on Hibo. It should have lasted no more than a second. Instead, it held. She felt it from across the room like a hand suddenly pressing against a locked door. There was no mockery in it, no flirtation either, only concentration, recognition without a source. Hibo's fingers tightened around the stem of a glass. Surely he was not looking at her, not truly. Men like Samir Aden looked through women like Hibo every day without seeing enough to remember they had done it. But he was looking, and for one impossible moment, the noise of the ballroom thinned around her. A voice cut through it. "Hibo." She turned sharply. Sarah stood by the side corridor, smiling with her mouth and not her eyes. "Come here." Hibo obeyed at once, keeping the tray steady as she crossed behind a cluster of guests. By the time she reached the corridor, Ifra had joined Sarah, and both sisters were wearing the kind of excitement that always meant danger for someone else. "What do you need?" Hibo asked quietly. Sarah leaned against the wall, arms folded. "A miracle, perhaps. But since we only have you, we'll settle for entertainment." Ifra laughed. "You should feel grateful, actually. Tonight is your big chance." Hibo's stomach tightened. "My chance for what?" "To finally be useful in public," Ifra said. Sarah stepped closer. "There's a live segment later, a little spontaneous surprise for the guests. Something fun, something memorable," No, Hibo said before she could stop herself. The word came out small, but it came. The sisters exchanged delighted glances. "If you can answer that quickly," Ifra murmured, "then you already know exactly what this is." Hibo looked from one face to the other. "Please don't do this." Sahara's expression hardened instantly. "Don't do what?" "Give you attention. Isn't that what poor girls like you secretly want?" Ifra came Marwo's voice from behind them. They turned. Marwo approached with controlled elegance, though annoyance flashed in her eyes at finding them in conversation with Hibo for longer than necessary. "The host is ready for the transition." "Are we prepared?" Ifra's lips curved. "Completely." Marwo looked at Hibo. "You will do exactly what you are told tonight." Hibo found courage only because terror had already exhausted her. "Madam, I serve in the kitchen. I don't belong on that stage." Marwo stepped close enough for perfume to sting Hibo's nose. "That," she said softly, "is precisely why people will enjoy it." Then, as if remembering the risk of witnesses, Marwo adjusted the girl's crooked sleeve, with a gesture almost maternal. Anyone seeing it from a distance might have mistaken it for affection. "You owe this family obedience," she continued, smiling. Everything you eat, every roof above your head, every scrap of cloth on your body, you owe it to me. Do not forget that." Hibo's throat tightened. She wanted to say the truth, that what Marwo called generosity had always felt like theft wearing perfume. That survival was not the same as debt, that nothing in this house had ever been given freely. But Ifra was already lifting a small flash drive between two lacquered fingernails. "The backing track is ready," she said. Sarah snorted. "Ready to collapse, you mean?" All three women smiled. That was when Hibo understood. Not just humiliation, or not only humiliation. A trap built with precision. They were going to put her in front of the city's elite, pretend to offer her a chance, and then let the music fail or distort so badly that the audience would tear her apart for sport. And because she was Hibo, because she was poor, scarred, and powerless, it would become the kind of story people repeated for pleasure. "Remember that servant girl, the ugly one, the one who thought she could sing?" Marwo watched the realization land. "Do not embarrass us more than necessary," she said. Then the women turned and walked back toward the ballroom, already satisfied. Hibo stood alone in the corridor for a few seconds that felt stretched beyond time. Her pulse beat so hard she could hear it. Somewhere beyond the doorway, the host was speaking into the microphone, warming the room, praising the sponsors, building the mood for the next segment. She should run. The thought flashed, bright and desperate. She could leave through the service gate, cut through the rear alley, disappear into the city before anyone noticed. Let Marwo rage. Let the guests laugh at her absence instead of her face. But another thought followed it, quieter and more dangerous. If she ran now, she would still belong to them. Not legally, not publicly, but inside. They would have proof forever that fear could move her exactly where they wanted. "Hibo." She turned. Abdi stood at the far end of the corridor, half in shadow, a cleaning cloth draped over one shoulder, as if he had simply wandered there by chance. But his eyes were fixed on her with full understanding. "They are calling for you," he said. "I know." She hated how thin her voice sounded. Abdi came closer, not too close. The ballroom noise swelled and faded around them. "Listen to me." She did. "Tonight they want the room to remember your shame." His face was unreadable for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "Give the room something else to remember." A ripple of applause rose from the ballroom. The host's voice boomed through the speakers. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, a little surprise from the Hassan household." Hibo closed her eyes. Her mother's voice returned to her, then not as memory alone, but as instruction. "You do not sing to impress. You sing to tell the truth." When she opened her eyes again, fear was still there, but it was no longer alone. She stepped toward the stage entrance. And inside the ballroom, seated in the front, IP row beneath the warm blaze of chandeliers, Samir Aidan turned slightly in his chair and fixed his eyes on the young woman being led toward the spotlight, as if every instinct in him had just started shouting at once. The spotlight hit Hibo so hard it felt like a blow. For one suspended second, she could see nothing beyond the white heat pouring into her eyes. Then the ballroom slowly returned in fragments, faces chandeliers, phones lifted in gleeful anticipation, glasses frozen midway to painted lips, diamonds flashing like tiny knives. She stood alone at center stage. The polished floor gleamed beneath her borrowed shoes. The microphone stood in front of her like an accusation. Behind the stage curtains, she could almost feel Ifra and Sarah vibrating with excitement. Somewhere to the left, Marwo watched with the poised stillness of a woman waiting for humiliation to ripen. And in the front VIP row, Samir Aidan sat motionless, his gaze locked on her face. The host, a broad man with too much confidence and not enough decency, smiled into the room as if cruelty were a party game. "Ladies and gentlemen," he drawled, our final little surprise before the featured performances, "we discovered quite by accident that one of the household girls here has aspirations." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. The host continued. Apparently she believes she can sing. That laughter grew louder, more comfortable now that permission had been given. Oh, let the poor thing try, a woman called from one of the side tables. Another voice rose. Maybe sadness sounds better in the kitchen? A burst of delighted noise followed. Hibo's fingers curled at her sides until her nails pressed into her palms. Her heartbeat slammed in her ears. She could feel every seam of the thin dress against her skin, every stare against the scar on her cheek, every layer of contempt in the room. She knew this feeling. Public shame had been the favorite language of her life. But never like this. Never under lights. Never before people whose wealth made them believe their amusement was a form of judgment. The host turned to her with exaggerated courtesy. Now, my dear, don't be shy. Sing us something beautiful. Behind him, one of the sound technicians inserted the flash drive Ifra had prepared. Hibo swallowed. She knew what would happen. The music would start wrong, warped, distorted, or suddenly cut out. The audience would laugh. The clip would spread across the city by morning. She would become a meme, a joke, a lesson in what happened when girls from the shadows forgot their place. From the front table, Sarah crossed one elegant leg over the other and smiled like a queen at an execution. Ifra lifted her champagne flute in mock encouragement. Marwo did not smile at all. She simply watched calm and certain, the way people watched storms they believed would strike someone else. The host stepped back from the microphone. Whenever you're ready. The technician pressed play. A shrill blast screamed through the speakers. The room flinched. Then came a mangled piano intro, pitched too high, then too low, wobbling grotesquely like a broken carnival machine. Gasps turned into laughter almost instantly. Several guests covered their mouths, shoulders shaking. One man slapped the table. Another lifted his phone higher to capture the disaster. Oh, this is priceless, someone whispered loudly enough to be heard. The track stuttered again, skipped, then dissolved into a harsh burst of static so violent that the microphone squealed in protest. And then silence. Not graceful silence, not reverent silence, broken silence. A dead sound system, a trap sprung too early, a room waiting for its victim to collapse. The host stared toward the technicians in annoyance. The technicians panicked. One bent over the soundboard. Another jabbed uselessly at buttons. Murmurs rolled across the ballroom in restless waves. This is embarrassing, a woman muttered. Yes, a man replied, laughing. For her. Hibo stood at the center of it all, breathing too fast. This was the moment, the exact moment Marwo had wanted. The failed music, the awkward pause, the entire city's elite watching to see what an ugly servant girl would do when stripped of the illusion she had been handed. Run, cry, beg, apologize for taking up space. Her mouth went dry. Her knees felt unsteady. Somewhere far away she heard her mother's voice, not as memory now, but as a living thread drawing tight through her chest. You sing to tell the truth from here. Hibo's eyes dropped to the microphone. Then slowly she lifted her head. The ballroom still rustled with mockery. A few people had already looked away, bored now that the joke seemed obvious. The host moved toward the front of the stage, perhaps intending to rescue the segment with another insult. But before he reached her, Hibo took one step closer to the microphone. No music, no signal, no introduction. She opened her mouth and sang. The first note entered the room like a clean blade through fog. Not loud, not forced, not trembling. Pure. It rose unaccompanied into the chandeliered air and hung there with such startling clarity that the host stopped walking. The technician froze over the console. A woman in the second row lowered her phone by instinct, as though her body had reacted before her mind could. Hibo sang the old melody Nadira had once taught her, when fever shook her small body and rain hammered their roof. A song with no ornaments, a song meant for truth. Her voice was warm, low at first, carrying the roughness of grief at its edges, not weakness but history. Then it lifted. The second phrase unfolded wider, stronger, wrapping itself around the ballroom's marble and crystal until the room that had been arranged for spectacle began against its will to hold something sacred. The laughter died, not faded, died. Every mocking face changed in a different way. Some stiffened in disbelief. Some blinked as if unable to accept what they were hearing. Some went suddenly blank the way people do when beauty arrives through a door they had nailed shut. Hibo did not look at them. That was the strangest power of all. She did not sing to prove them wrong. She did not sing for revenge or for applause or even survival. She sang because the song had been living inside her too long. Because humiliation had cracked something open. Because pain, when pressed hard enough, sometimes makes room for truth to emerge without permission. Her voice climbed into the chorus, and the ballroom changed. The chandeliers seemed too bright now, too brittle for what her voice carried. The luxury of the room, the floral arches, the polished silver, the smug faces suddenly looked thin, decorative, almost childish beside the force of one unadorned human sound. One of the women at the center tables let out a quiet gasp and covered her mouth, but this time not to hide laughter. A server near the drink station began to cry. The old pianist hired for the evening, seated beside the dead baby Grand, stared at Hibo with wet eyes and a parted mouth as though he had just been reminded of something holy he had nearly forgotten. At the front table, Sahra's smile vanished first. Then Ifra's. Marwo's face did not move, but the color drained from it so quickly that it was more revealing than panic would have been. No, her stillness said. No, this was not the script. The song reached its bridge, and Hibo's voice deepened instead of breaking. Emotion moved through it like fire through dry wood, controlled, terrible, beautiful. She was no longer the servant girl in an ill-fitting dress, no longer the joke, no longer the scar they had mocked. She had become the center of gravity in the room, and for the first time in years, everyone else was being forced to come to her. Samir Aiden rose to his feet. The motion was small, but in a room trained to watch power, it was seismic. Chairs shifted, heads turned. If Samir had stood to leave, people would have noticed. But he had not stood to leave. He stood because he could not remain seated. His eyes were fixed on Hibo with something far more dangerous than admiration. Recognition. Not full. Not yet. But enough to make his entire posture sharpen. The female assistant beside him whispered, "Sir." He did not answer. On stage, Hibo closed the final line of the song so softly that the last note seemed less to end than to dissolve into the air. Then silence fell again. This silence was different. Not broken, not mocking. Stunned. The kind of silence that appears after a truth so large. People need a moment to remember who they are in relation to it. No one moved, no one clapped, not because they were unimpressed, because they were still trying to recover. Hibo stood perfectly still, chest rising and falling, every nerve in her body awake. Fear returned at once the moment the last note vanished. Had she done too much? Had she broken some unseen rule? Had she exposed herself only to be crushed harder? Then a single sound cut through the room. Clap. Samir Aiden. One deliberate strike of his hands, then another, then another. The spell broke. Applause exploded across the ballroom like thunder cracking open the ceiling. Guests surged to their feet. Some cheered. Some shouted. Some clapped with astonishment still written openly on their faces. Phones lifted again, but now not to mock, to capture, to claim proximity to rewrite themselves beside what they had almost ridiculed. The host, stunned and sweating, tried to recover his smile. This remarkable young woman. But he was drowned out by the noise. Hibo blinked into the lights, unable for a second to understand what was happening. Moments ago they had wanted her humiliation. Now the room was roaring. At the front table, Ifra looked sick. Sarah gripped the stem of her glass so tightly, Hibo thought it might shatter. Marwo remained seated, but her hands had clasped so hard in her lap that the knuckles blanched white, and Samir was already moving, not away from the stage, toward it. Samir Aden did not hurry, but the room parted for him as if speed had become unnecessary. He stepped through the aisle between glittering tables with the calm force of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to command attention. The applause was still rolling through the ballroom in waves uneven now, confused by curiosity. Guests leaned toward one another, whispering fiercely. Some were already pretending they had believed in Hibo all along. Others stared at the stage with that restless hunger powerful people felt whenever a story shifted beneath their feet and threatened to leave them on the wrong side of it. Hibo remained where she was stunned by the roaring in her ears. It was not just the applause. It was the aftermath of fear, the crash that came after surviving something she had already believed would destroy her. Her hands were trembling now that the song was over. Her throat felt raw. The spotlight was still hot on her face. And Samir was coming straight toward her. The host, sweating through his polished smile, reached the foot of the stage first. "Well," he said too loudly into the microphone, "it seems our little surprise has become the sensation of the evening." A few nervous laughs answered him. They died quickly, because Samir had reached the steps. He ascended without asking permission. The host turned with the bright, desperate expression of a man uncertain whether he was about to be praised or publicly erased. "Mr. Aden, what an unforgettable moment." "Yes, we certainly did not expect," No, Samir said, taking the microphone from his hand with one smooth movement. "You did not." The room went still again. He did not shout. He did not need to. His words carried with that same controlled weight Hibo had noticed the moment he entered the ballroom. Samir turned first not to Hibo, but to the audience. "I sponsor music," he said, "because talent should be recognized, not toyed with. What happened here tonight was not a surprise performance. It was an attempted humiliation." A shock moved through the crowd. Chairs creaked. Eyes darted instinctively toward Marwo's table. The host gave a shaky laugh. "Surely that is a bit severe." "It was all in good fun." Samir looked at him. The man stopped speaking mid-breath. "Humiliation is often renamed fun by the people inflicting it," Samir said. "That does not make it harmless." At the front table, Marwo finally rose. She smiled with remarkable composure, though Hibo saw the strain around her mouth. "Mr. Aden, I am certain there has been a misunderstanding. The girl is shy and inexperienced. My daughters only wished to encourage her a little." Behind that polished sentence, Ifra and Sarah sat rigid, their earlier confidence dissolving by the second. Samir's gaze moved to Marwo, then to her daughters, then back to Hibo. "Encourage her," he repeated. The softness in his tone was far more dangerous than anger. Marwo spread her hands. "She has had a difficult life. We have done what we can for her, fed her, sheltered her, included her in our home. If tonight's arrangement was clumsy, then of course I regret that, but truly this is still a family matter." The phrase hit Hibo like a slap. Family matter. She had heard it her whole life, always used to bury the truth. Family matter when Marwo took her room. Family matter when Ifra tore her mother's dresses apart for amusement. Family matter when Sarah pushed her against the stove and left a burn she had hidden for weeks. Family matter when food was withheld, when punishment was private, when cruelty was dressed as discipline, and witnesses were made to feel rude for noticing. Samir turned to Hibo fully now. For a moment the entire ballroom seemed to disappear around the simple fact of his attention. "What is your name?" he asked. No one had asked her that publicly in years. Not properly, not without attaching a command to it. "Hibo," she said, barely above a whisper. He waited. Perhaps because he sensed that one word was not enough. Perhaps because he understood that names like Dignity needed full space to stand. "Hibo Hassan," she said more clearly. Something flickered in his eyes at the surname, but it vanished before she could identify it. "Hibo Hassan," he repeated into the microphone. The name traveled across the ballroom and came back changed by amplification. It sounded larger there, realer, like something being returned. "This evening does not end with a trick," Samir said. "It ends with a performance worthy of the room." Gasps broke out. Someone clapped once in excitement before stopping in embarrassment. The host blinked. "You mean you want her to sing again?" "I do." The crowd came alive at once, but in a different register, now thrilled, shocked, suddenly eager to align themselves with whatever Samir decided this moment meant. A famous fashion editor at Table 7 leaned toward her companion and whispered urgently, "If he backs her, she'll be everywhere by morning." Two producers near the stage were already typing into their phones. Hibo's breath caught. "Sing again." She had barely survived the first song. The room felt unstable beneath her feet, as though one wrong movement might tip everything back into disaster. Samir must have seen the panic flash through her face, because he stepped closer and lowered the microphone just enough for his next words to fall mainly to her. "You do not have to," he said quietly. That nearly undid her, because beneath the command of his public intervention, beneath the power and spectacle, was the first true choice anyone had offered her in longer than she could remember. "You have already proven enough." Her throat tightened. She looked out at the sea of faces, some hungry, some ashamed, some calculating. At Marwo, whose expression now carried the first real crack of fear. At Ifra and Sarah, who looked less like queens than cornered animals. At the chandeliers above them all glittering over lies. Then she looked back at Samir, and somewhere under the terror something steadied. "If I sing," she whispered, "they will hate me more." Samir's eyes did not leave hers. "Then let them do it, honestly." It was such a strange answer that it almost made her laugh. Instead, she nodded. He turned back to the audience and handed the microphone to one of the technicians. "Fix the audio," he said. "And this time, if it fails, the responsibility will not be hers." The technicians scrambled like men granted a chance to save their careers. At that exact moment, Sarah snapped. "This is absurd," she shouted, rising so abruptly her chair nearly toppled backward. "You are all acting as if she is some hidden star. She is a servant who knows one sad little song." The words struck the room and made it ugly again. Ifra stood too, though, with more calculation. "My sister only means that this attention is disproportionate. Hibo has always been dramatic. She knows how to make people pity her." There it was. Not denial, reframing. The oldest weapon of the cruel. Marwo stepped in smoothly. "Girls enough." But the damage had already widened. Sarah pointed toward the stage with a trembling, manicured hand. She stole that dress. A collective intake of breath swept through the front tables. Hibo felt herself go cold. Of course. The next move. If they could not destroy her talent, they would destroy her legitimacy. Make her seem deceitful, ungrateful, scheming. Drag her back into the old shape they preferred the poor girl who overreached. Marwo placed a hand theatrically over her chest. "Mr. Aiden, please understand. We did not want to expose her, but Hibo has always had difficult impulses. She borrows things without permission. She imagines herself entitled to spaces that are not hers. The lies slid out so easily they might once have passed for truth." For half a second, the room wavered. Hibo saw it happen. The recalculation in people's eyes. Their hunger for a more comfortable narrative. If the gifted girl could also be dishonest, then no one had to feel guilty for laughing at her. Moral discomfort could be converted into gossip. Everyone could go home clean. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but old habits strangled the words. Marwo knew that. She had built her silence carefully for years. Then Samir asked a single question. "To whom," he said, "does the dress belong?" Sarah faltered. It was from our family wardrobe. Samir glanced at the gown draped on Hibo's frame. The room followed his gaze. Now that he had directed it, the truth became impossible to miss. The dress was poorly fitted, cheaply altered, and visibly old. Not stolen glamour, not some dramatic costume theft. A cast-off, a discarded thing handed downward with contempt. The silence that followed was merciless. One woman near the center coughed to hide a laugh. Another man muttered, "That's your accusation!" Sahra flushed dark with fury. Ifra tried quickly to recover. It is not about the price of the dress. It is about her character. No, Samir said. It is about yours. The sentence landed like a blade. At table 9, someone began clapping again, uncertainly, then with more force. It spread in bursts, not for spectacle now, but for alignment. People smelled power settling onto one side and rushed to stand there. Marwo understood it too. Hibo saw the exact moment calculation replaced pride. The older woman's eyes sharpened, searching for a new route through the disaster. Hibo, Marwo said suddenly, her tone softening into wounded maternal concern. "Come down from that stage. You are overwhelmed. Let us handle this privately." Hibo stared at her. For years that voice had worked on her. The false gentleness, the public softness masking private violence. But tonight, the mask was visible even to others, and visibility changed everything. Samir stepped back, giving Hibo space, not shielding her, not speaking for her, simply making room for her answer to exist. It was the first real confrontation of her life, and this time the room was watching Marwo, not Hibo, for its cue. Hibo lifted her chin. "No," she said. The word shook, but it did not break. Marwo's expression froze. Hibo swallowed and tried again, louder. "You asked me all my life to stay silent. Tonight I won't." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The technician signaled from the console that the audio was ready. Samir looked at Hibo one last time. There was no smile in his face, only that same steady recognition, as though he believed something important was unfolding and did not intend to interrupt it. "Then sing," he said. And in the front row, Marwo sat down slowly for the first time in years, looking like a woman who understood that control, once cracked in public, rarely returned whole. The second song did not begin the way the first one had. The first had risen from a wound. This one rose from a choice. Hibo stood at center stage, while the technicians carefully rebuilt the sound around her, and for the first time that night, the microphone did not feel like a trap. It felt dangerous in a different way now, because it could carry not just her voice, but her existence. Every breath she took beneath the chandeliers seemed to gather the room tighter around her. No one laughed anymore. Even the guests who still disliked her had become too alert to hide behind mockery. Power had shifted, not fully, not safely, but enough that everyone in the ballroom could feel the floor moving beneath the old arrangement. Samir returned to the front row instead of remaining beside her. That small decision mattered. He had defended her, but he would not turn her into his possession in the same breath. Hibo noticed that though she could not yet have explained why it steadied her. The pianist hired for the evening approached the restored grand piano and asked softly, "Do you know the key?" Hibo hesitated, then named it. He nodded once as if confirming a professional instinct and placed his hands on the keys with new respect. When the first notes flowed into the room, they were clean, restrained, and patient. Hibo closed her eyes for half a second, not to hide, but to listen. This melody came from much further back than the kitchen, much further back than Marwo's cruelty, all the way to the one-room flat where Nadira had once taught her that songs were living things, and if treated honestly, they would reveal more than the singer intended. So, Hibo sang again. This time the room did not meet her with shock alone. It met her with surrender. Her voice filled the ballroom with an ache so luminous it made expensive people remember against their will that money could not buy absolution from loneliness. The song was one Nadira used to sing near dusk, when the city noises turned softer and grief became easier to admit. It told of a traveler carrying light inside broken hands, of losing home, of finding it again in a place that first looked like ruin. Several guests lowered their heads. One woman pressed her fingers hard against the corner of her eye. At the front table, Ifra stared at Hibo with an expression that had moved past hatred into something raw and less dignified panic at the realization that the story was no longer theirs to narrate. Sarah, on the other hand, looked like she wanted to tear the stage down with her bare hands. Marwa watched without blinking, but Samir was different from all of them. He was not merely impressed. Hibo could feel that much even from the stage. He was searching, listening with the concentration of someone following a voice through memory, trying to locate the original room where he had first heard an echo of it. When the performance ended, the applause came faster this time, deeper, less confused. It rose to its feet almost at once. The force of it rolled across Hibo's skin. She bowed automatically breathless, and the pianist beside her inclined his head, as though standing next to greatness required humility. Then, before the noise had fully settled, Hibo saw movement at Marwo's table. Too late. Sarah strode toward the stage steps with rage burning openly across her face. Hibo Marwo hissed from behind her, low and vicious. "Sit down!" But Sarah had already mounted the stage. The room stiffened. Phones lifted again, sensing a new climax. Hibo took one instinctive step back. Sarah stopped less than an arm's length away, eyes bright with humiliation and venom. Up close, her makeup could not hide how badly she was unraveling. "So this is what you wanted," Sarah said, voice shaking. "A few songs and suddenly you think you're better than us. I didn't ask for this," Hibo replied quietly. "That's a lie." Sarah looked out at the crowd, as if begging them to restore the old hierarchy by force of agreement. "She has been planning this," she said, "always watching us, always pretending to be small while she waited to steal her way into rooms she does not belong in." There was movement in the audience, restless, uncertain, but not the support Sarah wanted. Hibo saw it before Sarah did. So Sarah lashed out. Her hand shot forward, gripping the neckline of Hibo's dress. Gasps tore through the ballroom. "Haven't you taken enough?" Sarah snapped. The fabric pulled hard. Hibo grabbed at it instinctively, but not fast enough. The thin material stretched, then shifted. From beneath the dress, the silver chain around her neck slipped free and flashed under the stage lights. The pendant swung once between them. Everything changed. Samir stood up so abruptly his chair scraped the floor. Hibo had seen him attentive, controlled, even angry in a disciplined way. She had not yet seen him shaken. But now color left his face so quickly it was as if someone had struck him. Sarah released the fabric, startled by the intensity of the reaction she had triggered. The pendant settled against Hibo's chest, a small oval silver casing worn smooth by years of hidden use. One edge bore a tiny engraved star, almost erased by time. Samir took a step toward the stage, then another. His voice, when it came, was low and disbelieving. "Where did you get that?" The room went quiet again, but this time the silence was different from shock or awe. It was the silence that comes when private history suddenly collides with public ruin. Hibo touched the pendant automatically. "It was my mother's," she said. Samir was already climbing the steps. Marwo rose so quickly her chair tipped backward. "Mr. Aiden." "Stay where you are," he said without turning. She stopped. On stage, Samir stood a few feet from Hibo, his eyes fixed on the pendant with an intensity that made even Sarah step away. Up close, Hibo saw something she had not expected in him. Not just recognition. Pain. "Open it," he said. Her fingers trembled. "It's jammed. It hasn't opened in years. Let me see it." He did not snatch. He held out his hand and waited. After one heartbeat, then another, Hibo lifted the chain over her head and placed the pendant in his palm. Samir stared at it, as if staring into a wound that had never closed properly. His thumb moved over the engraved star, then the hidden notch at the side. With practiced pressure, he pressed and twisted. The pendant clicked open. A collective breath passed through the ballroom. Inside, protected beneath scratched glass, was a tiny photograph. Faded by time, a young woman with luminous eyes and a warm, unguarded smile, seated beside a thin teenage boy, whose face, despite youth, despite softness not yet carved into adulthood, was unmistakably Samir's. Hibo stared. The ballroom erupted into whispers. "No, that's him. How is that possible?" Marwo's hand flew to her mouth. Sahra looked from the pendant to Samir in total confusion. Ifra had gone deathly still. Samir did not appear to hear any of it. For several seconds he said nothing. His eyes remained locked on the photo, and when he finally lifted his gaze to Hibo, the discipline in his face had altered. Something old had broken the surface. "Your mother," he said. Voice roughened by memory, was Nadira Hassan. It was not a question. Hibo's throat tightened. "Yes." Samir closed the pendant slowly, carefully, as though handling a relic. "I thought she had disappeared," he said, more to himself than to the room. No one knew what happened after the studio scandal. They said she left the city. Then they said she had become unstable. Later they said she was dead, but no one could tell me where she was buried. The guests were listening now with the hungry intensity of people who sensed that tonight's drama had roots much deeper than gossip. Hibo barely understood what he meant. "You knew my mother." Samir looked at her, then the way one looks at a locked door, suddenly finding its key. "When I was 17, he said I was sent away after my father's second marriage, officially to study. In truth, to be removed. I fell apart that year. I stopped speaking for weeks. I stopped eating properly. I was angry, ashamed, and young enough to mistake isolation for strength." His voice remained controlled, but memory moved underneath it like weather beneath dark water. The building where I was staying had thin walls. Every evening from the flat next door, I heard a woman singing to a child. The same songs, over and over, gentle, never showy. Not for performance. For comfort. Hibo felt her pulse change. Samir continued, eyes still on her. "One night I collapsed outside the staircase after an argument with my father on the phone. I must have blacked out for a few minutes. When I opened my eyes, your mother was beside me. The room seemed to lean closer. She brought me water, sat with me until I could breathe normally. She said very little. But before she left, she said something I never forgot." His gaze dropped briefly, as if hearing the words again. She said, "The world trains wounded boys to become hard men. Resist that if you can." A strange stillness passed through Hibo. That sounded exactly like Nadira, like the woman who had spoken in truths that only made full sense years later. Samir looked again at the pendant. "After that, I heard her sing often. I never saw much of her. She kept to herself, protected you fiercely, but she changed something in me without knowing it." The old pianist on stage wiped discreetly at his eyes. A woman near the back whispered, "My God." Hibo's voice came out barely audible. "Why does this pendant matter to you?" Samir answered without hesitation. "Because I bought it for her." The room exploded into murmurs again. He lifted the pendant slightly. "It was the only expensive thing I owned then. A foolish purchase for a lonely boy trying to feel significant. I offered it to thank her. She refused at first. I told her to keep it for the child because one day the child might need proof that someone had seen them both and remembered." Hibo felt suddenly unsteady. All her life the pendant had been the one object Marwo seemed to fear. The one thing Nadira had preserved, the one inheritance that had survived the stripping of everything else. And now a billionaire stood before half the city, staring at it as if it had just reopened a sealed grave. Marwo took one step forward from the front row. "This is sentimental confusion," she said sharply. "A coincidence. Nothing more." Samir turned his head toward her at last. "No," he said. "It is the beginning of a question." He handed the pendant back to Hibo with care. His fingers did not touch hers longer than necessary, but his next words struck with quiet force. "If your mother kept this," he said, "then she expected the truth to matter one day." Then his gaze shifted to Marwo. "And judging by your face, Mrs. Hassan, you already know exactly which truth that is." For 3 full seconds after Samir's words, no one in the ballroom breathed normally. The silence did not feel empty. It felt charged, like the instant before lightning split a tree in half. Marwo Hassan had built her life on control. Hibo knew that better than anyone. She controlled rooms with elegance, narratives with practiced tears, men with flattery, women with exclusion, servants with fear, and children with the steady violence of making them doubt their own memory. Even now, under hundreds of watching eyes, Marwo did what people like her always did first. She smiled. It was a beautiful smile from a distance, refined, regretful, almost maternal. Up close, Hibo could see the strain in it, like cracks under polished paint. "I think Marwo said carefully that we are allowing emotion to turn a touching coincidence into a public accusation." A few people in the audience shifted uncertain again. Wealthy rooms loved truth only when it arrived elegantly packaged. Anything messier made them nervous. Samir descended 1 step from the stage, but did not sit. "Then explain your face when you saw the pendant." Marwo's answer came instantly. "Because I recognized Nadira's jewelry." Hibo's heart lurched. Marwo turned to the room, sensing she needed volume structure and the appearance of generosity. "Yes? Nadira was my late husband's cousin. After she died, I took Hibo in out of duty. That is not a crime. The girl was grieving, unstable, difficult to manage. I made sacrifices for her that no one here understands." There it was again. Sacrifice. Duty. The clean words she used to perfume ugly deeds. Ifra, reading her mother's strategy, stood slowly. "Mother is right. Everyone is being unfair. Hibo always hated discipline. She turns every rule into victimhood." Sarah found her voice next, though it trembled. "She was never treated like a servant. She just refused gratitude." The lies came so quickly, so smoothly, that for one nauseating moment, Hibo felt the old panic rise again. This was how it always happened. Marwo lied with confidence. Ifra lied with polish. Sarah lied with force. And Hibo, who had survived by staying quiet, was left choking on truths she did not know how to shape fast enough for public consumption. Marwo saw the hesitation and pressed harder. When Nadira died, she said, now speaking directly to Samir, there were debts. Confusion. No stable arrangements. I was the one who prevented that child from ending up on the street. A murmur passed through the ballroom. That version sounded plausible. Respectable. Noble, even. Hibo stared at Marwo in disbelief. Not because the woman was lying. That was expected. But because she was lying with the same face she had used when withholding food. The same calm, polished dignity she had worn while watching children suffer. Something inside Hibo went hot. Before she could decide whether to speak, another voice cut through the ballroom. "She is lying." It came from the side of the room, low but clear. Heads turned. Abdi stood near the service entrance, still in his maintenance clothes, one hand resting on the back of a chair he had clearly stopped pretending to adjust. Under normal circumstances, most guests would barely have noticed him. Tonight, every eye in the room swung toward him at once. Marwo's composure cracked for the first time. "Abdi," she said sharply, "this does not concern staff." Abdi ignored her. He began walking toward the center aisle with the uneven gait Hibo had seen all her life. Yet tonight, somehow the limp made him look not small, but battle-worn. A man carrying history in his body. "I worked for Nadira Hassan before Marwo ever entered that house," he said. Not as a cleaner. As a driver, then, house steward, when Nadira was still receiving royalties. The ballroom erupted into whispers again. Samir's full attention shifted to him. Hibo's pulse pounded so hard she felt lightheaded. Marwo laughed, but too quickly. This is absurd. He is old. He remembers things poorly. Abdi stopped a few feet from the stage and lifted his chin. No. I remember them clearly because I watched them happen. He turned not to Marwo first, but to Hibo. Your mother was not poor when she died, he said. She was sick. That is different. The room went dead still. Hibo's breath caught. Abdi continued. Nadira had music rights savings and a trust document prepared for her daughter. She knew her health was failing. She was frightened of what would happen to Hibo if the wrong people got close. That is why she arranged papers, witnesses, instructions. Samir spoke quietly. What papers? Abdi's jaw tightened. A will, custody conditions, a property transfer, and a letter. Hibo felt the world tilt under her feet. A will, a letter. For years she had lived inside deprivation so total that the idea of her mother having left structure behind felt almost unbearable. Not because it promised wealth, but because it meant Nadira had tried. She had tried to protect her, tried and failed because someone stronger, crueler, more shameless had intervened. Marwo stepped forward. This is fantasy. If such documents existed, where are they? In the place you could not find. Abdi said. That answer hit Marwo like a stone. Hibo saw it plainly. Not confusion, recognition. Ifra looked from her mother to Abdi and went pale. Sarah's face drained of color more slowly, as if her mind resisted understanding. Samir caught it too. You searched for them. Marwo straightened. Of course I searched. There were legal matters after a death. Abdi's mouth hardened. No, you searched because you knew what was in them. Marwo snapped. Careful. But Abdi was past fear now. He reached into the inner pocket of his worn jacket. The room tightened all at once. Security took one reflexive step forward. Samir lifted a hand without looking at them, and they stopped. Abdi withdrew not a weapon, but a sealed brown envelope, weathered at the corners from age and careful hiding. Hibo stared at it. Abdi held it with both hands like something that had grown heavier every year. Nadira gave me this 3 days before she died, he said. She told me only to use it if Hibo's safety or inheritance was threatened. She said if her daughter reached adulthood in dignity, I should burn it and let her live free. But if anything felt wrong. His eyes moved to Marwo with undisguised contempt. I was to place it in the hands of someone powerful enough that the truth could not be buried. The silence that followed was suffocating. Marwo moved so suddenly that even in heels she nearly stumbled. Give me that! Samir stepped between them before she could take a second stride. No. It was a soft word. Final. Marwo's nostrils flared. This concerns my family. Samir did not move. Exactly. Abdi looked up at the stage. Miss Hibo, you should be the first to know what your mother left. Hibo could not move for a second. Her whole body felt split between dread and hunger. Part of her wanted that envelope opened immediately, the truth ripped into the room like thunder. Another part wanted to run from it. What if it contained proof not only of theft, but of how vulnerable her mother had been? What if the last years had been worse than even she imagined? Samir seemed to read at least part of that fear. He turned slightly, looking up at Hibo. This is your choice. Again that word. Choice. It struck her harder than kindness ever had. All her life, other people had chosen for her what she wore, where she stood, how much she ate, what version of her past she was allowed to keep. And now, in front of the same world that had laughed when she was dragged under a spotlight, the decision was being returned to her. Her hands were shaking, but she stepped down from the stage. The crowd parted as she approached Abdi. Up close she could see his eyes were wet. He had carried this for years. hidden it, protected it, watched her suffer, perhaps waiting for the right moment, and fearing each year that the right moment had already been lost. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she whispered. Pain crossed his face. "Because I had no proof that could protect you if I failed, and because Marwo still had too much power while you were a child. I waited until the truth had a witness stronger than her money." His eyes flicked briefly toward Samir. Hibo looked at the envelope in his hands. Her name was written on the front in faded ink. For Hibo, when truth becomes necessary. Her knees nearly gave way. That was her mother's handwriting. Not memory, not imagination, not a story. Proof. She touched the paper as though it might vanish. A sound broke from Marwo, not a full cry, but a sharp intake of breath that exposed more guilt than any confession could have. Samir heard it too. "You knew." Marwo's control snapped. "Of course I knew," she shouted, and the ballroom recoiled. The words were out before she could stop them. The damage landed a heartbeat later. Ifra whispered. Mother Marwo turned on her daughters with animal fury, then back to the room too far gone now to recover with grace. "You want the truth," she hissed. "Fine." Nadira was weak, sentimental, foolish with money. She would have wasted everything on that girl. A collective gasp rolled across the crowd. Hibo did not feel shocked. She felt cold, deeply, cleanly cold. Marwo stepped forward, eyes bright with years of resentment finally stripped of concealment. "I saved what she would have squandered. I built order from her chaos. That child had nothing but a pretty voice and a dead woman's softness. She would have lost everything in a year. She was a child," Samir said. Marwo laughed once, brittle and ugly. "And I made her useful." The sentence hit the room like poison. Sarah covered her mouth. Ifra, for the first time, looked not strategic, but horrified. Hibo's fingers closed around the envelope so tightly the edges bent. A memory flashed, hands pushing her away from the family table. Another Marwo calling her ungrateful for crying after a slap. Another Sarah shoving her into the wall, Ifra laughing, Marwo watching and doing nothing. Another the burn on her arm. The nights hungry. The music forbidden. The little deaths of dignity repeated so often they had begun to seem normal. And underneath all of it, the final truth rising now with brutal clarity. This had not been accidental cruelty. It had been a system. Samir's voice came out like steel drawn slowly from its sheath. "You forged documents." Marwo tried weakly to recover. "You cannot prove that." Abdi answered at once. "The proof is in the envelope, and the original transfer ledger is hidden where Nadira ordered me to keep it." Samir looked at Hibo. "Open it." Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. Inside lay a folded letter, notarized copies, and one thin legal document bearing Nadira Hassan's full signature. Hibo unfolded the letter first. She recognized the first line immediately because only one person had ever written her name with that kind of tenderness. "My little Hibo. If you are reading this, then someone has tried to steal not only what belongs to you, but the truth of who you are." Tears blurred the page. The ballroom disappeared, and for the first time since her mother died, Hibo was no longer standing alone inside the lie. Hibo did not realize she was crying until a drop struck the paper and blurred the final word of the first line. Her fingers tightened around the letter. For a moment, the ballroom, the chandeliers, the cameras, the perfume, the social panic fell away entirely. There was only her mother's handwriting, steady and graceful, despite the weakness that must already have been creeping into her body when she wrote it. "My little Hibo. If you are reading this, then someone has tried to steal not only what belongs to you, but the truth of who you are." Her breath shook. She forced herself to continue. Nadira's letter was not long, but each sentence seemed to open a sealed room inside Hibo's life. Her mother wrote that illness had come faster than expected, that she had trusted too few people and feared too many, that she had created a legal trust in Hibo's name, transferred her music royalties, and set conditions for any guardian who might claim custody. No guardian, the letter said, was ever to control the principal assets outright. The funds were to be preserved for Hibo's education, health, and eventual independence. The house title, along with future royalty income, was to remain in trust until her adulthood. And then came the sentence that froze the blood in Hibo's veins. If Marwa Hassan ever gains access to these documents, do not trust her tears. A raw sound escaped somewhere in the crowd. Hibo looked up. Now they all knew. Not rumor, not emotion, not interpretations battling in elegant language. Evidence. Written fear. Written warning. Written love. Marwa had gone completely still. Ifra looked as if she might faint. Sahra had backed several steps away from her mother, not from morality yet, but from instinct. Even she could smell collapse. Samir spoke first, his voice quiet enough that people leaned in to hear it. Read the rest. Hibo lowered her gaze again, blinking through tears. Nadira wrote that Marwa had begun visiting more frequently in the final months, offering help too eagerly, asking pointed questions about documents, accounts, and beneficiaries. Nadira admitted that she had smiled and accepted the visits for Hibo's sake, but she did not trust the woman's motives. So she had made duplicate copies, one set with lawyers, one set hidden, one final sealed packet with Abdi. There was more. Nadira wrote of the pendant, of Samir, of the strange kindness of a grieving teenage boy who had once gifted her the silver locket in thanks for a kindness she felt she had barely given. She called him the wounded child with old eyes. She wrote that if Hibo ever met him again, she should know that goodness could survive power if it was planted early enough. A stunned murmur swept through the room when Hibo reached that part. Samir did not move, but Hibo saw it land. Then she reached the last paragraph. If they tell you that you are ugly, small, burdensome, or lucky to be tolerated, know that they are naming their own emptiness and hanging it around your neck. Do not wear it. You were born with a voice. One day use it not only to be heard, but to free yourself. Hibo lowered the letter slowly. No one spoke. Several of the guests were openly crying now, not all of them from goodness, some from shame, some from spectacle, some because the truth had arrived in a form too intimate to dismiss. Samir held out his hand. May I? She passed him the legal documents. He scanned the first page, then the second. His expression hardened with every line. These are notarized trust instruments, he said. Witnessed, time-stamped, registered. He looked up at Marwa. You did not inherit her estate. Marwa found her voice in a sudden rush of fury. A few papers prove nothing. People change documents after death all the time. The woman was delirious. Abdi answered immediately. The registration numbers can be verified tonight. Samir nodded once toward his assistant, who had already moved closer. Photograph everything. Contact my legal team. And call Inspector Njoroge directly. The assistant didn't hesitate. Yes, sir. That was the moment the social air in the ballroom changed for good. Until then, many guests had remained merely interested. Curious. Cautious. They wanted to see who would win before deciding what morality required of them. But Call Inspector Njoroge was not the language of gossip. It was the language of consequence. Phones lifted again, but not casually now. Producers texted lawyers. Executives whispered to spouses. The host looked like he wished the stage would split open and bury him. Two women who had earlier laughed at Hibo were now loudly telling each other they had felt something was wrong from the start, desperate to rewrite themselves into the correct side of history. Marwa saw it all. For the first time, fear fully stripped the Polish from her face. She pointed at Hibo with a trembling hand. After everything I did for you? No, Hibo said. The room went quiet instantly. The word did not come out, frightened this time. It came out clean. Marwo blinked at her. Hibo stepped forward, letter in one hand, shoulders straight, despite the tremor still moving through her body. You do not get to use that sentence again. Not tonight. Not ever. Marwo's face twisted. Ungrateful girl, you starved me. A gasp moved through the ballroom. You called it discipline. Hibo continued. You took my mother's house and called it responsibility. You made me serve at my own table and called it shelter. You let your daughters hurt me and called it family. Ifra whispered, Stop! But Hibo was past stopping now. She turned not only to Marwo, but to the room. You all saw me tonight when I was useful for entertainment, she said. But I have lived in that house for years. People visited, donors, churchwomen, business associates, neighbors, staff. All of you praised her elegance. Some of you saw bruises and asked no questions. Some saw me cleaning in torn clothes and accepted the explanation that I was difficult or troubled. Cruelty survives because it is often dressed well enough for polite people to ignore it. That landed harder than anything else, because it was not just an accusation against Marwo. It was an accusation against the entire ecosystem that had allowed her. Silence deepened now with real discomfort. A woman near the back lowered her eyes. One older man removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose like someone suddenly exhausted by his own cowardice. Sarah snapped under the pressure. It wasn't all mother, she burst out. Ifra did worse than I did. Ifra whirled on her. You burned her arm, you cut her hair while she slept, you pushed her into the stove. Their voices crashed into each other, shrill and panicked. Marwo hissed, Enough. But it was too late. The daughters had turned. Years of shared cruelty were now becoming evidence. Samir's assistant murmured, recording and kept her phone trained steadily on them. Sarah, crying now from rage rather than remorse, pointed at Ifra. She gave Hibo that scar. The room recoiled. Hibo felt as though the floor had vanished beneath her. The scar. That scar had shaped years of mockery, years of self-conscious silence, years of being called ugly by people who needed visible damage to justify cruelty. Ifra went white. It was an accident. No, it wasn't. Sarah shot back. You threw the glass oil lamp because she sang better than you. Ifra lunged toward her sister, but security moved in before she could reach her. Chairs scraped. Guests stumbled back to make space. The ballroom, once built for glamour, now looked exactly what it had always secretly been, a stage, where rot had simply lost the power to stay hidden. Marwo's voice rose to a pitch Hibo had never heard in public. You stupid girls! Samir turned to security. No one leaves. One of the guards hesitated. Sir, legally. Until police arrive, no one directly involved leaves this property, especially her. He looked at Marwo. The woman who had ruled Hibo's life for years suddenly looked much smaller than her silk gown. Still, she tried one last move. She looked at Hibo and let tears gather in her eyes. Real ones this time, perhaps. Fear could do that. Hibo, she whispered. Whatever happened, we can resolve it privately. Please, do not destroy this family. The sentence might once have worked. Not because it was persuasive, but because Hibo had been trained to feel responsible for disasters she did not create. Tonight the training failed. Hibo looked at the woman who had stolen her childhood. Her inheritance, her mother's memory, her voice, and almost her sense of self. Then she answered with absolute calm. You destroyed this family the day you decided my pain was useful to you. Marwo's tears stopped. That was the final break. 10 minutes later, the first police vehicles entered the estate. The grand doors opened. Uniformed officers crossed the marble with professional speed, followed by 2 financial crimes investigators, and Inspector Njoroge himself, a broad-shouldered man with tired eyes that sharpened immediately when Samir handed him the copied documents. The inspector read in silence for several moments, then asked only 3 questions, where the originals might be who had physical possession of estate records over the last decade, and whether anyone present wished to revise statements already made on camera. No one answered immediately. Then Sarah collapsed into a chair and began sobbing. Ifra demanded a lawyer. Marwo lifted her chin and said nothing. The inspector nodded once, as if he had seen this exact combination of guilt and arrogance many times before. Marwo Hassan, he said, you are being detained pending investigation into fraud, document falsification, coercive control, and financial misappropriation of a minor's protected estate. A collective shudder moved through the room. He looked at Ifra. And Sarah next. You will both accompany us for statements regarding abuse, concealment of evidence, and related offences. Sahara cried harder. Ifra started protesting. Marwo finally spoke, but only to say, This is not over. Inspector Nyoroge replied evenly, No, it is finally beginning. As officers moved in, several of the guests stepped back as though proximity itself might stain them. The same people who had once sought Marwo's approval now avoided her eyes. Poetic Hibo thought dimly. Cowardly, but poetic. The ballroom had gone from mockery to music to revelation to arrest in a single night. And as Marwo was led away past the same tables where she had once ruled with polished cruelty, she turned her head one last time toward Hibo. There was no apology in her face, only hatred. Hibo met it without flinching, because for the first time, hatred was no longer stronger than truth. 3 months after the night Marwo Hassan was led out of her own ballroom in handcuffs, the city still spoke of little else. But cities were strange creatures. They could turn a woman's suffering into headline poetry for a week, a morality tale for a month, and background noise by the next season. Nairobi had already begun doing what powerful places often did after public scandal. It converted pain into conversation, then conversation into branding, then branding into distance. Hibo understood that faster than most. Reporters wanted interviews. Lifestyle magazines wanted photographs of the servant girl who stunned the elite. Music producers sent polished messages full of admiration and percentages. Churches invited her to sing. Television hosts called her story inspiring, as though inspiration had been the point of surviving abuse. Wealthy women who once ignored her now sent flowers and carefully worded notes about resilience, dignity, healing. Some of them truly meant it. Some of them wanted proximity to a story that had become untouchably fashionable. Hibo learned to tell the difference. She did not move into a penthouse. She did not begin appearing at every gala in sequined gowns. She did not turn her mother's name into a slogan and herself into a product. The trust documents were verified. The estate was legally restored. Nadira Hassan's royalties, hidden accounts, and the rights to several unreleased compositions were returned to their rightful beneficiary. The house title once stolen through falsified transfers reverted as well. Samir's legal team ensured the proceedings moved faster than Marwo's remaining allies had expected. By the time the case entered full prosecution, the evidence was too extensive for elegance to bury it. Still, restoration did not feel like triumph every day. Some mornings Hibo woke in a quiet room and could not understand why no one had banged on the door before sunrise. Some nights she stared at a full plate of food and felt irrational panic as though abundance were another trap waiting to punish gratitude. She still folded her clothes too neatly, ate too quickly, apologized when no apology was required, and startled when footsteps approached from behind. Freedom, she was learning, was not a door. It was a practice. On a cool morning in early July, Hibo stood in the old music room of Nadira's house, her house now, though the thought still felt too large to wear comfortably. Dust sheets had been removed. The windows were open. The room smelled of polished wood and the faint sweetness of jacaranda drifting in from the garden. At the center of the room sat a restored, upright piano. It had taken weeks to track it down. Marwo had sold it years earlier, telling people it had been too damaged to keep. But Abdi, who remembered more than anyone guessed, had recognized the buyer's name, buried in an old ledger. Samir had dispatched someone quietly. Money and persistence reopened one of the city's closed doors. Now the piano stood where it had once stood when Nadira was alive. Hibo laid her fingers on the lid and shut her eyes. She could almost hear her mother humming. "You don't have to force memory," came a voice from the doorway. She turned. Samir stood there without entourage, without the armor of public presence. He wore a simple charcoal shirt with the sleeves folded once, dark trousers, and the expression of a man who had knocked softly, but would have waited if she had not heard. Since the scandal, he had visited only when invited. He helped where needed, offered resources before opinions, and had the rare gift of knowing when to step back from another person's grief. That alone made him dangerous to Hibo in a way she had not expected. Kindness without control had become harder for her to understand than cruelty ever was. "I wasn't forcing it," she said. Samir's mouth moved in the faintest near smile. No, Hibo glanced back at the piano. Maybe a little. He stepped inside. Sunlight caught the side of his face, softening the severity that newspapers loved to call ruthless. Up close, he seemed less like a billionaire than a man who had spent years becoming precise because imprecision had once cost him too much. "They found the final publishing contract," he said. "It confirms the royalties from the East African recordings should have continued for another 9 years. They were diverted to shell accounts linked to Marwo's advisors." Hibo exhaled slowly. "More stealing." "Yes," she let out a brief, humorless laugh. "At this point, I'm surprised she didn't steal the roof tiles." Samir's smile widened just enough to make him look unexpectedly young. "Give the auditors time." That made her laugh for real. The sound surprised both of them. It lingered between them a moment longer than either acknowledged. Behind them, Abdi passed the open doorway carrying a stack of folders. He paused, watched Hibo's face for half a second, and something like peace moved through his old features before he continued down the hall. He had accepted a formal position as estate manager only after Hibo insisted 3 separate times. He still disliked the title, said it sounded too polished for a man with bad knees and no patience for fools, but he had agreed, not for status, for guardianship, finally made honest. Samir walked toward the window and looked out over the neglected rear garden. "Have you decided Hibo joined him?" "About the academy." He nodded. This was the question that had followed her for weeks. The lawyers expected her to preserve the estate conservatively. The music industry wanted her launched commercially, while the story was still hot. Public relations advisors wanted a memoir, a televised charity concert, a campaign around empowerment. Everyone had a profitable version of her future to suggest. But Hibo had been thinking about children instead. Children with gifted voices but no safe rooms to use them in. Children who were mocked before they learned to defend themselves. Children whose talent would never survive long enough to bloom if left in the hands of people who measured worth by class, beauty, or usefulness. She had spent too many years in silence to worship fame. "I've decided," she said. Samir waited. "I want the academy." He didn't speak at once, which was one of the reasons she trusted him. He never rushed to celebrate in ways that made other people's convictions feel smaller. "Why?" he asked. Hibo looked out at the broken stone bench under the jacaranda tree. "Because music saved me before it rescued me. It gave me somewhere to exist even when I had nowhere to belong. If I build only a career, maybe I become successful. But if I build a place—" She swallowed. "Maybe someone else escapes sooner than I did." Samir turned toward her fully. In his eyes, she saw not admiration alone, but recognition, the kind that passed between people who had both once been rescued by the same invisible force and did not intend to waste that fact. "It's the right choice," he said. She smiled faintly. That sounded dangerously like agreement. It was. "I'll try not to make a habit of it. You already have." their eyes held for a beat too long. Hibo turned away first, pretending interest in the cracked path below. The academy took shape faster than she expected, and slower than she wanted. That was how meaningful things seemed to happen. Nadira House Academy of Music and Voice was established not in the wealthy district where donors felt virtuous, but near the edge of a crowded neighborhood where children with real need could actually reach it. An old community hall was purchased, reinforced, painted, wired, and filled with second-hand instruments, restored by craftsmen who worked like they were mending more than wood. Hibo visited almost every day. She interviewed teachers herself, refused anyone who spoke more about prestige than patience, accepted one stern choir master with no social grace because children leaned toward him when he spoke, hired 2 widowed sisters who could cook for 100 without waste, converted one back room into counseling space after meeting a 12-year-old boy who flinched every time someone applauded too suddenly. When local media came to document the progress, they expected grand speeches. Instead, Hibo handed out paintbrushes. She painted walls beside students, carried chairs, sorted sheet music, learned the names of every child in the first intake group. Some came barefoot, some came hungry, some arrived loud with defensive bravado. Others did not raise their eyes for the first week. Hibo recognized them all. One afternoon, while helping unpack donated microphones, she heard a timid voice behind her. "Teacher Hibo." She turned. A small girl of perhaps 9 stood clutching a frayed schoolbag with both hands. She had wide, solemn eyes and a scar across one eyebrow. Beside her stood an aunt who kept apologizing for the child's silence. The girl looked at Hibo's cheek, then quickly down again. "My aunt says you sing," the child whispered. "I do." The girl hesitated. "I don't. Not in front of people." Hibo crouched until they were eye level. "That's all right," she said. "Some voices begin in private." The girl studied her for a long second. "Did they laugh at you first?" The question was so honest that it hurt. "Yes," Hibo said. The girl considered that, then nodded with grave satisfaction, as if a necessary credential had been confirmed. "Then maybe I'll stay." That evening, Hibo stood alone in the half-finished rehearsal hall after the children had gone home. Sunlight angled gold across stacked chairs and fresh paint. On the far wall hung the Academy's simple motto, chosen from Nadira's final letter. "Do not wear other people's emptiness." She heard footsteps behind her and knew without turning that it was Samir. "You're smiling," he said. "Am I? You are." Hibo looked around the hall. "I think this place is going to matter." "It already does." He stepped beside her, not touching, just sharing the same view. For a while they stood in silence, the kind that did not ask to be filled. Then Hibo said, "You never told me why you kept looking at me that first night." Samir was quiet long enough that she almost thought he wouldn't answer. "When you were carrying that tray," he said at last, "I saw your mother's eyes." Hibo turned slowly toward him. He met her gaze steady and unguarded. "And when you sang," he added, "I heard the reason I survived long enough to become the kind of man who could come back when it mattered." Emotion rose so suddenly in her chest, she had to look away. Outside, children's laughter drifted faintly from the street. Inside, the light softened. Hibo did not yet call what was growing between them love, but she knew this much. It did not feel like rescue. It felt like recognition, and after a life built on erasure, recognition was its own kind of healing. On the night Nadira House Academy officially opened, the city arrived dressed for redemption. Cars lined the street outside the renovated hall in a slow, glittering curve. Children in neatly pressed uniforms clustered near the entrance, eyes bright with the nervous pride of being included in something larger than themselves. Volunteers hurried between rows of chairs. Teachers adjusted music stands. Reporters gathered behind velvet ropes, careful now, reverent, now eager to document not scandal, but transformation. Inside, warm golden light pooled across polished wooden floors and newly painted walls. The hall was not luxurious in the way Marwo's ballroom had been. There were no crystal chandeliers, no imported marble, no cold displays of wealth arranged to intimidate. But there was something stronger in the room. Purpose. Every chair had been filled by intention. By survivors, donors, musicians, social workers, journalists, children from the neighborhood. A few judges, several former staff from Marwo's household who had quietly left after the arrests, and people who had known Nadira when she was alive and had come carrying old guilt in their faces. At the back of the hall, Abdi stood with his hands clasped behind him, wearing a dark suit that did not quite hide how uncomfortable he was in formal clothing. But his eyes moved constantly across the room, checking doors, checking children, checking Hibo's path to the stage. The way he always did now, not because he doubted her strength, but because love, after failing once to shield someone, often became vigilant in practical ways. The case against Marwo was still moving through the courts, but enough had already been proven to destroy the mask she once wore. Fraud, coercive abuse, falsified estate transfers, witness intimidation, financial theft from a protected minor's trust. Ifra and Sarah had each turned against the other in hopes of reduced sentencing. In the end, truth had not arrived cleanly or nobly. It had arrived with panic bargains, tears, legal documents, and ugly testimony. That felt fitting. Hibo had stopped believing that justice needed elegance to be real. Tonight, none of that was the center. Tonight, the center was a stage built for voices that had once been told to stay small. Backstage, Hibo stood before a mirror and adjusted the simple ivory gown she had chosen for the opening concert. It was beautiful, but not extravagant. Soft lines, long sleeves, no glitter meant to prove worth. Around her neck hung the silver pendant Nadira had left her, the same pendant that had turned a public humiliation into the beginning of truth. Her hands were steady. That surprised her. The old Hibo would have expected trembling before a room this large. The girl who had once stood in an ill-fitting dress under a hostile spotlight should have been shaking. But something profound had changed in the month since that night. Fear no longer vanished when she stepped into visibility. It simply stopped deciding for her. A soft knock came at the half-open door. Samir. He stood there in a black suit, no tie, one hand resting lightly against the frame. His presence still altered air around him, but in private moments like this, the force of him felt quieter, more human. More dangerous somehow because it invited trust instead of demanding awe. "They're ready," he said. Hibo looked at him through the mirror. "Are you—" He gave the smallest smile. "I'm not the one singing." "No, you're only the man who insisted half the city attend. I invited them," he corrected. Insisting came later. That made her laugh softly. He stepped farther inside, his gaze moving over the room before settling on her. For a second he said nothing, and the silence between them held a weight that neither of them had learned to treat casually. "You look—" He stopped. Hibo turned from the mirror to face him. What Samir's eyes rested briefly on the pendant, then returned to her face. Like someone no one gets to rewrite again. Emotion moved through her chest so swiftly she had to steady her breath. "You always say things like that as if they are simple." "They are simple," he said. "Simple is not the same as small." Outside the room, applause rose for one of the student ensembles finishing their performance. A shy violinist from the second intake group had just completed her solo, and the audience was clapping with the particular tenderness reserved for courage witnessed in public. Hibo listened, smiling. "This is the best part," she said. "Hearing them before they know what they sound like to other people." Samir leaned one shoulder against the wall. "And what do they sound like?" "Like doors opening. He looked at her for a long second. "You built that?" "No," she said quietly. "My mother did. I'm just the part she couldn't finish." Samir's expression changed then, deeper, almost sorrowful, but warm with it. "You give grief too little credit. It rarely builds anything this alive unless someone very brave keeps showing up after it." The words sat between them. Hibo lowered her eyes for a moment. When she looked up again, she found him closer than before, not invading, not presumptuous, simply nearer. "Samir," she said softly. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" He understood at once. Men like him were trained to act quickly. He had not. That had never been accidental, because after everything that was taken from you, he said, "I did not want love to sound like one more thing arriving to claim space before you could claim your own." That answer struck her with almost unbearable gentleness. All at once she remembered every small restraint he had practiced, every choice offered instead of decided, every question instead of assumption, every step back precisely when another man might have stepped forward to secure a yes before the moment changed. Respect, she realized, could be as intimate as desire. Perhaps more. Before she could answer, Abdi appeared in the doorway, clearing his throat with theatrical severity. "If you two are done speaking in unfinished poetry," he said, "there are 200 people waiting for the founder of this academy." Samir stepped back and Hibo laughed through the sting suddenly bright in her eyes. "Thank you, Abdi. I prefer punctuality to gratitude," he muttered, though the softness in his face ruined the effect. A few minutes later, the stage lights warmed. The final segment of the opening concert had been announced. The student choir filed off after their closing refrain. The hall dimmed into expectant hush. At the side curtain, Hibo waited with the microphone in hand and listened as the host, a local arts teacher, rather than a polished socialite, introduced her not as a scandal survivor, not as a hidden heiress, not as the girl from the headlines, but as the founder of Nadira House, and the voice behind its first promise. That mattered. Titles shape memory. When Hibo stepped onto the stage, the audience rose before she sang a note. The standing ovation hit her with visible force. She stopped for half a second, beneath the lights, not blinded now, but held. She saw children she had taught clapping with radiant faces, women from the neighborhood pressing palms together in pride, men who once would not have noticed her standing with genuine respect. She saw Abdi in the back row, chin-lifted eyes wet and unapologetic. And beside the front aisle she saw Samir standing too, his gaze steady on her with that same impossible mixture of tenderness and certainty that had first unsettled her months ago. The applause softened. Hibo lifted the microphone. "This academy exists," she said, "because one woman believed music could protect what the world tried to destroy." She touched the pendant at her throat. "My mother, Nadira Hassan, did not live long enough to build this house with her own hands. But she built it in another way through every song she used to keep fear from winning." The hall was silent now. "I was once told that shame should make a person quiet, that pain should make them smaller, that survival itself was enough. But survival is only the beginning. The real miracle is what happens when someone teaches you that your voice does not belong to the people who wounded you." A child in the second row began crying silently. Her teacher put an arm around her shoulders. Hibo drew one breath and continued. "So tonight I want to sing the last song my mother ever wrote for me." She nodded to the pianist. The opening chords flowed into the hall like dusk arriving over still water. It was not the song she had sung in Marwo's ballroom. That song had been a breaking open. This one was different, tender, mature, carrying grief without being defined by it. A melody of return, of mourning that no longer begged, of love passed forward instead of buried. When Hibo sang, the hall did not react with shock the way the ballroom once had. These people knew what she could do. The wonder was not in discovery now, but in witnessing what her voice had become once it no longer had to fight, just to exist. She sang for Nadira, She sang for the girl she had been. She sang for the children seated along the side rows, still deciding whether the world might hold a safe place for them after all. By the time she reached the final chorus, there were tears across the room. Not theatrical ones, not fashionable ones. The deep, involuntary kind drawn out when art reaches something inside a person they have been too busy or too defended to touch. As the last note faded, the hall remained silent for 3 full breaths. Then applause rose again, stronger, fuller, threaded now with love. Hibo lowered the microphone heart full to the point of pain. And then she saw movement. Samir was walking toward the stage. A murmur spread through the audience, but it was softer than gossip, warmer than surprise. Many of them had already guessed. Children leaned forward. Abdi closed his eyes briefly, as if surrendering to inevitability. Samir reached the stage steps and climbed them with the calm certainty she knew so well. When he stopped beside her, he did not take the microphone from her hand. He accepted a second one from the side table because even now he would not interrupt her voice to insert his own. The hall quieted. Samir turned first not to the audience but to Hibo. "I had planned a better speech," he said, and scattered laughter moved warmly through the room. But better speeches tend to sound intelligent, and this is not an intelligent moment. It's an honest one. Hibo smiled, despite the sudden rush of tears threatening again. Samir faced the audience briefly. "Many of you know me as a businessman. Some know me as difficult. A few know me as correct, even when I am difficult, which is rarer and more useful." More laughter. Then his voice softened. "But long before any of that, I was once a frightened boy who survived because a woman with almost nothing still found the grace to be kind. Years later, her daughter did something even more dangerous. She survived without becoming cruel." He turned back to Hibo fully. "That is the reason I love you." The room seemed to stop breathing. Samir continued, eyes never leaving hers. "Not because you sing beautifully, though you do. Not because this city finally sees what it should have seen sooner. Not because your story moved the world. I love you because after every humiliation, every theft, every lie, you chose to build refuge instead of revenge. You chose to become shelter." Hibo's tears spilled freely now. Samir reached into his pocket and withdrew not an ostentatious jewel, but a simple ring of elegant design, bright, unmistakably valuable, yet restrained enough to feel chosen rather than displayed. Then he did something even more important. He did not kneel immediately. He said clearly enough for every child in that hall to hear, "If your answer is no, nothing about my respect changes. If your answer is later, I will wait. If your answer is yes, I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve it." Only then did he go down on one knee. "Will you marry me, Hibo Hassan?" The hall held itself still around him. Hibo looked at him through tears and light and memory. At the man who had entered her life, first as witness, then ally, then proof that power could kneel without losing dignity. She looked at the children watching, at Abdi openly weeping now, and not pretending otherwise, at the academy walls bearing her mother's words, at the stage where her voice had become not survival alone, but hope. Then she answered the simplest truth she had. "Yes!" The hall erupted. Children cheered, teachers cried, reporters forgot professionalism. Abdi sat down hard in the back row and covered his face with one hand while laughing through tears. Samir rose, placed the ring gently on Hibo's finger, and when he gathered her into his arms, the applause seemed to shake the very walls of Nadira House. Outside, Nairobi's night stretched vast and restless. Inside, the girl they had once mocked as an ugly Cinderella stood in light of her own making. She did not need a crown. She had something better: her name, her voice, her truth, and a future no one would ever again be allowed to steal. If Hibo's journey moved you, tell me in the comments which moment hit your heart the hardest. And if you believe stories about justice, healing, and powerful comebacks matter, subscribe and stay with us for the next unforgettable story.